Texas has always carried a reputation for its rugged landscapes, cowboy legends, and unforgiving justice system. But behind the steel doors of its sprawling prison complexes lies a battlefield few on the outside ever see. These institutions, massive, overcrowded, and filled with some of the nation's most violent offenders, became breeding grounds for criminal empires. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice runs the largest prison system in the United States, housing more than 100,000 inmates. Inside these walls, survival depends on alliances, and alliances often turn into armies. Two of the most powerful forces within this hidden world are the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, a white supremacist prison gang known for its brutality and rigid hierarchy, and Tango Blast, a loosely organized but massive Latino network that has grown into one of the largest prison gangs in the state. Their conflict is not just about race. It is about power, drugs, and the control of life inside and outside prison. For decades, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas dominated prison yards through fear and violence. They were small in numbers, but notorious for discipline and ruthlessness. But as the prison system grew, a new enemy rose to challenge them: Tango Blast. Unlike traditional gangs with a structured chain of command, Tango Blast functioned more like a family, united by city pride and sheer numbers. What they lacked in hierarchy, they made up for in strength. The stage was set for a gang war that would spill beyond prison walls, affecting neighborhoods, drug markets, and entire communities across Texas. This is the story of how two of the most dangerous forces in the Texas underworld collided, leaving behind a trail of blood, broken lives, and ongoing chaos. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, ABT, was born in the early 1980s, inspired by, but not directly connected to, the infamous Aryan Brotherhood of California. Its founders were hardened white inmates who believed they needed a group to protect themselves from rival gangs, particularly the growing Latino and Black factions in Texas prisons. What began as a defensive brotherhood quickly evolved into an empire built on crime, loyalty, and hate. The ABT operated under a strict military-style hierarchy. At the top were chairmen, regional commanders who oversaw operations across prison units and on the streets. Beneath them were generals, majors, and lieutenants, each responsible for enforcing discipline and ensuring members followed the gang's rules. To the ABT, betrayal was punishable by death. Loyalty was absolute. Once you swore allegiance, there was no walking away. While white supremacist ideology was at the heart of their identity, the ABT was never just about race. They were businessmen in the underworld. From drug trafficking to extortion, they turned prison units into hubs of organized crime. They controlled methamphetamine distribution, forced inmates to pay taxes for protection, and carried out hits ordered by leadership. Their reputation spread quickly, crossed the ABT, and you might not survive the week. Law enforcement struggled to crack their organization. The gang was secretive, communicating through coded letters, tattoos, and smuggled cell phones. Their reach extended beyond prison fences, with street crews handling drug sales, robberies, and enforcement. By the late 1990s, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had cemented its place as one of the deadliest gangs in the state. But even the strongest organizations faced challenges. For the ABT, that challenge would come from a force unlike anything they had encountered before. A group with no central leadership, no rigid structure, but numbers so vast they could overwhelm even the most disciplined soldiers. In the 1990s, a new gang began to emerge from the Texas prisons: Tango Blast. Unlike the ABT, Tango Blast wasn't born from ideology or strict codes. Instead, It was created from the need for unity among Hispanic inmates, particularly those who didn't want to be controlled by traditional Mexican gangs like the Texas Syndicate or the Mexican Mafia. Tango Blast was different. Instead of a rigid hierarchy, it was a loose network built around city-based cliques known as tanguitos. Members from Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and other cities formed their own factions, united by city pride. What bound them together wasn't constitution or chain of command. It was survival, loyalty to their hometown, and sheer strength in numbers. Inside Texas prisons, Tango Blast grew explosively. By the 2000s, they had become the largest prison gang in the state. Their decentralized model made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to dismantle them. Unlike the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, which could be crippled by taking out its leaders, Tango Blast had no single boss to target. If one member fell, dozens more could take their place. On the streets, Tango Blast members controlled drug corners, carried out robberies, and engaged in human smuggling. They also recruited heavily from neighborhoods, pulling in young men who saw them as protectors and power players. The gang's strength lay in numbers and mobility. They could outnumber almost any rival gang inside and outside of prison. The rise of Tango Blast posed a direct threat to the ABT. The Brotherhood had always relied on fear and order to maintain dominance, but now they faced a sprawling enemy that refused to play by the same rules. The first sparks of violence between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and Tango Blast ignited in prison yards. Overcrowding placed both groups in close quarters, and tensions quickly boiled over. For the ABT, every Latino gang was a potential enemy. But Tango Blast was different. They weren't just another gang. They were a tidal wave. In certain prison units, ABT members were outnumbered 10-1. Despite their smaller numbers, the Brotherhood struck first, relying on fear and precision attacks to show they wouldn't be pushed aside. Fistfights escalated to stabbings. In one incident, a single ABT soldier was attacked by a group of Tango members during recreation, sparking days of retaliatory violence. What began as personal disputes turned into a broader racial conflict. White supremacist ideology collided with Latino pride, fueling a cycle of revenge. Prison officials began noticing patterns: assaults during mealtimes, ambushes in showers, and entire dorms erupting into chaos. The ABT relied on its reputation for brutality, targeting high-ranking Tango members to intimidate the rest. But Tango Blast responded in numbers, swarming their enemies and overwhelming them. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice recognized early that this was more than just prison fights. It was the beginning of a gang war that would spill far beyond the razor wire. At the heart of the conflict between ABT and Tango Blast was one of the most lucrative businesses in Texas, the drug trade. Methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine flowed through prisons like underground currency. Whoever controlled the supply controlled the power. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had long dominated meth distribution. They established supply lines, used outside connections to smuggle drugs into prison, and forced smaller groups to pay taxes. For years, their system worked. But Tango Blast changed everything. With their massive numbers, they didn't need permission. They moved drugs through their networks, often bypassing ABT's control. On the streets, the war intensified. In Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, drug corners became battlegrounds. ABT soldiers carried out executions on rivals who refused to pay taxes. Tango members retaliated with shootings and ambushes. Law enforcement began noticing that murders in Texas cities often traced back to these two groups. The ABT's strength lay in discipline and organization. But Tango Blast's strength was adaptability. While the Brotherhood focused on meth, Tango Blast expanded into heroin, marijuana, and human smuggling. Their decentralized structure made them harder to track, and their members often blended into neighborhoods as ordinary street hustlers until violence erupted. The competition for drug profits wasn't just about money, it was about survival. Inside prison, drugs were power. On the outside, they were influence. The gang that controlled the flow of narcotics would control the futures. The war between ABT and Tango Blast escalated into cycles of retaliation. Each act of violence sparked another, creating an endless loop of bloodshed. Inside prison, members carried out ambushes in showers, recreation yards, and chow halls. A stabbing of an ABT member would be answered with a targeted attack on a Tango soldier the following week. Prison guards often discovered weapons, shanks, sharpened metal, even makeshift spears, hidden in cells. Violence was so common that some units were placed on lockdown for weeks at a time. On the streets, the bloodshed was even more visible. Drive-by shootings, kidnappings, and executions became tools of war. A BT hit squads targeted Tango Blast members who challenged their control over meth markets. In retaliation, Tango Blast crews hunted down ABT soldiers in bars, neighborhoods, and even outside prison gates during parole. One law enforcement officer described the conflict as chess with human lives. Every move was calculated, every killing sending a message. But the problem was simple. Neither side was willing to back down. For the families of gang members, life became a nightmare. Mothers buried sons. Children grew up without fathers. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. What began as a prison rivalry had grown into a full-scale war touching every corner of Texas. By the mid-2000s, the war between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and Tango Blast had reached a point where the violence could no longer be ignored. Bodies were piling up in prisons, murders on the streets were rising, and the drug trade that fueled both organizations was spreading unchecked through Texas communities. For law enforcement, the message was clear. These gangs were not just a prison problem. They were a statewide criminal empire, and dismantling them would require a coordinated, long-term offensive. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas was the first major target. Federal prosecutors recognized that the ABT, with its rigid chain of command, operated much like a mafia family. The gang's military-style structure made it vulnerable. If investigators could identify and eliminate its leadership, they could weaken the organization as a whole. In 2012, a sweeping indictment struck at the heart of the Brotherhood. Nearly 35 members, including high-ranking generals and lieutenants, were charged with racketeering, drug trafficking, extortion, and multiple murders. The federal government used the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, to portray the ABT as a criminal enterprise, allowing prosecutors to tie together dozens of crimes into a single case. The indictments read like the script of a crime drama. One ABT commander ordered the execution of a member who had failed to follow orders. Another orchestrated methamphetamine shipments across county lines. The gang's green light system, which marked individuals for death, was laid bare in court documents. In some instances, even family members of suspected traitors were targeted. Federal prosecutors painted a picture of an organization so ruthless, so violent, that nothing short of life sentences could contain it. And life sentences were exactly what many ABT leaders received. The indictments crippled parts of the gang's leadership structure, forcing the Brotherhood to reorganize under immense pressure. Yet even as commanders were locked away in federal supermax facilities, the violence did not end. Smuggled cell phones and coded letters allowed imprisoned leaders to continue giving orders. If the ABT was vulnerable because of its structure, Tango Blast posed an entirely different challenge. Law enforcement officials quickly realized that the gang's decentralized model made them nearly impossible to dismantle. Tango Blast had no single leader, no central hierarchy, no written constitution. They operated in city-based families, and if one group was taken down, another quickly rose to fill the void. Investigators called it a Hydra effect. Cut off one head, and several more appeared. This flexibility frustrated police and prosecutors. Traditional RICO cases relied on proving a chain of command, but Tango Blast's network defied that model. Instead of going after leaders, law enforcement was forced to target mid-level operators, drug traffickers, and violent offenders one by one. The result was like plugging leaks in a dam that refused to break. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice attempted to contain the chaos inside prisons by separating ABT and Tango Blast members, imposing lockdowns and tightening control of recreation yards. Yet smuggled contraband, corrupt staff, and sheer numbers made total control impossible. Every lockdown was temporary, and every crackdown seemed to spark a new wave of retaliation once restrictions were lifted. The war against ABT and Tango Blast became a study in contrasts. The Brotherhood could be wounded by decapitating its leadership, but it was resilient enough to survive underground. Tango Blast, on the other hand, thrived because it had no head to cut off. Together, they represented the ultimate challenge for law enforcement. One gang bound by fear and structure, the other bound by culture and numbers. The crackdowns slowed the violence, but never stopped it. Behind prison walls and on the streets, the war continued, proving that even the strongest indictments and the harshest sentences could not completely dismantle an enemy that had become part of Texas itself. By the mid-2000s, the gang war was no longer confined to prison yards. It had fully spilled into Texas neighborhoods. In Houston, residents described living in fear as drive-by shootings linked to ABT and Tango Blast tore through communities. In Dallas, rival drug crews clashed openly on street corners. In San Antonio, police tied a string of murders to gang rivalries connected to both groups. The impact went beyond crime statistics. Families living in gang-controlled neighborhoods often faced intimidation. Businesses paid extortion money. Young men were pressured to join one side or the other, pulled into a war they barely understood. Schools became recruitment grounds. Tango Blast, with its city-based identity, appealed to youth who saw it as a source of pride. A BT preyed on disaffected white youths looking for belonging and power. Communities bore the scars of a war that showed no signs of slowing. For law enforcement, every shooting became another piece of a larger puzzle. For the gangs, every life lost was just another step in an endless cycle of retaliation. Today, the balance of power between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and Tango Blast remains fragile. Tango Blast has grown into the largest prison gang in Texas, with thousands of members inside and outside prison. Their numbers give them dominance in many units, making them nearly impossible to challenge head-on. They are flexible, decentralized, and deeply embedded in Texas communities. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, though smaller, remains one of the most feared gangs. Their reputation for violence keeps them relevant. Even when outnumbered, their ability to carry out organized hits and enforce discipline makes them dangerous. The rivalry between ABT and Tango Blast continues, marked by outbreaks of violence across Texas prisons and neighborhoods. Neither side has claimed total victory, and neither seems willing to surrender. For prison officials and law enforcement, the struggle is ongoing. Every year brings new cases, new murders, and new crackdowns. Yet the war remains unresolved, a constant reminder of how deeply gang culture has taken root in the Texas underworld. The conflict between the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and Tango Blast is more than just a gang war. It is a symbol of the struggles within America's prison system and beyond. It shows how overcrowded prisons create fertile ground for gangs. It shows how ideology, pride, and profit can fuel cycles of violence that last for decades. And it shows how battles fought behind bars can spill into the streets, affecting families and communities far from the prison walls. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and Tango Blast continue their war, each adapting to survive, each refusing to yield. For every member who falls, another rises. For every crackdown, another scheme emerges. The story of their war is not finished. It is still being written in the yards of Texas prisons, on the streets of Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, and in the homes of families caught in the crossfire. Behind the walls of Texas prisons, the war never ends. It only waits for the next spark.